Good to see everybody for class this morning. Just before class, we did put out a new sheet on the back table for next week's study. And when we did the outline of where we're heading in the book of James, for some reason we did not outline a section for chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. But that outline is on the back table. So if you're looking at the syllabus or the outline and you say, you know, we skipped over verses 1 through 6 of chapter 5. We're not going to do that. We didn't put it in the outline. But there is a new sheet on the back table for the first 6 verses of chapter 5. Today we are at the very end of chapter 4, and if you're missing those notes, on the very back there's a 3-shelf rack on the back. And there's some extras. I did go through this morning, and I cleaned out a bunch of previous classes. There were just a bunch of papers in the back. If you're needing one of those and you find you don't have something that you would like to have, you can always say something, and I can print it off the computer real quick, and you can have that. But I tried to clean it up in the back so it's easier to find today's material and the next week's material. Let's be turning our Bibles to James chapter 4. James chapter 4. All right, so today we are in verses 13 through 17 of James chapter 4. And then, like I said, next week we'll cover verses 1 through 6 of chapter 5. All right, so let's read the section, and then we're going to go back and discuss verses 13 through 17. Let's start in verse 13. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell, and make a profit. Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. All right, so in our notes today, we have, I think, 3 discussion questions. So let's start with the first one, and this kind of introduces the basically the theme of this passage, and then some things we're going to look at. It's interesting. We're kind of picking from bits of the text to answer some questions. So when we answer this one, we're going to pull in verse 16, and then we'll pull verse 15 into another question in just a moment, but we'll get all the verses. Here's the first question. Reading this, is there anything wrong with making plans in life? And if not, then what is James rebuking in this passage? According to verse 16, what's the problem? So what are your thoughts on that generically? Is it making plans that he's against here? And if not, how do we know that? What's going on in this passage? Any thoughts? What is it? Okay, so it may not necessarily be about the plans, but the kinds of plans that they're making. Yeah. So there's a difference in the kind of plans Paul made versus the plans that they seem to be making here. So it has a lot to do with the attitude of the person who's making the plans. Gloria? Yes. Yeah, and I think when we get to verse 16 in a minute, I think that's the real danger here is if we make plans without God in the picture, and they happen to come to place, who do we give the credit to? We take the credit for that, right? We say, look what I've done with my own hands. Look, I've shaped my future. And so that's the point we're working toward in just a moment, because I think that's the warning in verse 16. So let's take a look at verse 13 beginning. When he says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell, and get gain. We have been talking about, since early in chapter 4, and really since chapter 3, we've been talking about worldly wisdom and the kind of affections that attend worldly wisdom, right? You set your affection on the earth. There's kinds of envying and strife that come from that. And then he gets to chapter 4 and opens it up and says, you better stop your fighting. But that's also the product of worldly wisdom. If you're looking at verse 13, do you see a connection with verse 13 to what we've been talking about, or do you think it's entirely disconnected? How would you view this passage? Do you think it's a new thought, or do you think he's still connected to what we've been talking about? I'm just curious if you saw anything in that. Do you think it's still the same general context? How do we connect it then? What's the connection? Okay, and that's it. That's right. Because if we go back to, for example, if you go back to chapter 3, where he started this whole thing about worldly wisdom, right? He says, verse 14, if you have bitter envying and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. Drop down to verse 16. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. Do you see that pride and that self-seeking? Do you see it in what James is rebuking here in chapter 4? So there seems to be a connection, right, in verse 13 to that same kind of being lifted up in pride and disregarding God. It seems to be consistent with what he just spoke of. So this section is now addressing those who are caught in the sin of presumption, of presuming that life can be planned and lived without God, where there's no recognition of divine providence at all in the affairs of life. And if we go back to chapter 10 of chapter 4, verse 10, he said, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord and he'll lift you up. And this now seems to be almost a practical demonstration of what it looks like when we don't humble ourselves so that God can lift us up. But what we see in this passage is a prideful person who sets his own way. So let's go back to this issue of making plans. All right, so we've had Terry and Joel both illustrated differently, but I think it proves the main point that making plans in and of itself is actually not a bad thing, right? It's good to make plans. Art? Yes.
Sunday after that.
Sure.
We've already made plans in the future.
Yes.
And we don't know if we'll be able to get there for one reason or the other. But
yeah, so making plans is not a bad thing. And it's not just travel plans. Is it okay to plan, for example, financially for the future? Yeah. Is it okay to make plans with your health so that in the future you have better health in the future? Yeah, those aren't bad things. So planning in and of itself is not bad. Let's take a look. Oh, yeah, Tom, sorry, I didn't see your hand.
We're also taught to be good stewards.
Yes.
You need to be good, not just of your money and so forth. You need to be good stewards of your life.
Of everything, yes. In every opportunity that God blesses us, we have to be a good steward of that opportunity. So
making plans,
yeah,
in my opinion,
it's just part of it.
Part of being a good steward.
I totally agree. Look at Romans chapter 1. Let's take a look. Joel mentioned this, or examples like this. Take a look at Romans chapter 1. Let's go to there. Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. Let's take a look at verse 10. So here's Paul writing. And he's talking about some of the petitions he had offered to God. He said in verse 10, making a request, if by some means, now at last I may find a way in the will of God to come to you. So to Joel's point, did Paul in his ministry often plan to be with certain people at certain times? He did. Now, what's interesting is if we think about this, did Paul eventually make it to Rome? Did he get there probably how he thought he was going to get there? I doubt he thought he was going to end up in Rome the way he probably planned to get there. God fulfilled his request, but it worked out totally different than he intended for it to work out, at least from Paul's perspective. Art?
I guess I've read that a lot of times. I've run right over that path that way, so that I might find a way in the will of God.
In the will of God.
Run right over that.
And the will of God was there. It was very different than Paul. likely perceived it. No one in Paul's shoes would have thought, I'll end up there, but I'll end up there as a prisoner on my way to execution. He probably didn't perceive that, but Paul was glad finally to make it Rome. Let's take a look at Luke chapter 14. Here's another example, Luke chapter 14. So this is an illustration by the Lord. We probably know this illustration well. If we started quoting it, you could probably finish the illustration. It's just a very familiar illustration about serving the Lord. So he starts that passage, verse 26, by saying that you have to love the Lord first. You have to love less. He uses the word hate here, but it just means to love less. Father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, yes, his own life also. In order to be the disciple of the Lord, we have to put God first. So look at verse 27. Whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. And then he illustrates. For which of you intending to build a tower does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? Is that about planning? It's about planning, right? So you got Don and Darty are near the end of their planning process that started a long time ago, and Gail and Willard are just at the very beginning with that, that process where they're starting to build a house. You have to plan for that stuff. Everything has to be planned out because you end up not being able to fulfill the plan. So we all plan practically, right? This is just another illustration of that. And then if you go to the Proverbs, we're not going to look at all these, but if you're interested in some of these references, Proverbs 16, verse 9. Right, Proverbs 16, verse 9. Proverbs 15, 22. All those are about planning. And then the one we're most familiar with, Proverbs 6, verses 6 through 11, where he illustrates with the ant, right? He says, go to the ant, you sluggard, you lazy man, and look how it prepares. It's industrious in the summertime so that it has enough for the wintertime. That's planning, right? And even from a divine perspective, did God plan things from a divine perspective? Right? So he set in motion a plan and followed that plan throughout history. So James is not opposed to planning. And I know sometimes you'll hear people say, you should just live for the moment and you never should plan ahead because you're distrusting God if you plan ahead. That's not what he's suggesting here. This is not against planning. But look at verse 13 again. He says, come now, you who say. So there's a certain kind of person he's pleading with to listen to him. This is not accidental planning. This is deliberate plans about their future being made a certain way. So he's addressing these people specifically. And all of their planning was based upon their own preference, their own timing, their own place, their own time to remain there, their own chosen activities. And I don't know if you noticed this, and I could be wrong in the comparison here, but when I read this reminds me a lot of another story on the part of Jesus. When he's talking about, I'm going to go here and I'm going to do this today, and I'm going to stay this certain amount of time, and I will do this with my riches, and I will do this. Do you remember an occasion where Jesus said, life does not consist in the abundance of the things you possess, and then he illustrates it with a rich man in a parable who said, I've got barns, and I'll tear them down, and I'll build back more, and I'll have great, and I'll take my ease, and I'll eat, drink, and be merry. And the parallel between these two, it's hard to dismiss the parallel because it almost seems as if James is presenting that same thing with just different wording about someone who basically presumes that they can just plan life without God as a part of the planning process. And God is absent in both of these, here in James and also in the one that is presented by Jesus. So what this really does, what this passage is really about, it is about our worldview. It's about how we construct our worldview. And if I had a big, I should have put it on a chart this morning, but if you look at, let's say you have, a pie, you have a circle, right? We generally would cut a pie, you try to divide it equally, you have, maybe 8 pieces of a pie. The way that a secular view of the world, and we're very influenced to do this with every part of our life. If you reach down and you grab a piece of the pie and you pull one piece of the pie out, the way that we sometimes divide our life up, well, that piece might be the God piece, right? So we have that piece of the pie, and that's the God piece. Another piece of the pie that's separate from the rest of them might be our politics piece. and then our history piece, and our biology piece, and our job piece, all right? You go through these pieces of a pie, and you have all these different pieces: money, job, family, friends, recreation, God, politics, whatever it is, and they're just all individual pieces of a pie. That's not how life works, not from a Christian perspective. Because when we're looking at that circle, the entire circle for the child of God is God, right? And then everything else fits within inside that circle. So if I'm thinking about planning, well, God has to be part of my planning because I'm a Christian. And if I'm thinking about politics, well, God has to be part of my politics because I'm a Christian. If I'm thinking about my job, then God has to be part of my job because I'm a Christian. I'm thinking about handling money, I've got to do it from the God perspective because it's not individual pieces of a pie. It's all together. It falls within the context of God. And these people here are guilty of segmenting their life and not allowing God to affect their planning. Everything in life is to be regulated by our relationship with God. So here's the problem. Gloria identified it earlier. Look at verse 16. We're going to draw this into our discussion of verse 13 now. He said, "But now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil." The word boasting here is the word that means empty braggart talk. Literally, an insolent and empty assurance which trusts in its own power and resources and shamefully despises and violates divine laws and human rights. That's the technical definition of that. But basically, it's claiming sufficiency without God. And they were doing it, and they weren't just doing it, they were rejoicing in it. Look what I've done. Look what I've done by myself. They were boasting over their supposed control of their own life. Now, don't want to leave the wrong impression. Do you have control of your life, or are you a free decision maker? Can you do that? We can do that, right? The difference is we can make decisions, but it has to be with regard to God. Because he says any kind of decision making like that in verse 16 at the end is evil. It is viciously wicked. So the danger is, and I think Gloria alluded to this, it's setting a plan. Let's say I don't even consider God, right? I'm like the man in Luke 12. I tear down my barns. I build bigger barns. At the end of that, if I've not had God in the process, again, who do I give the credit to? Look what I've done. Boy, I'm powerful. Look what I've just shaped and controlled my life. And if it comes to pass, I end up praising myself for my plans and my accomplishments. And James says when we do that, it's sinful. It's evil to do that. So it's wrong to make plans without God in the picture. All right, so that brings us to number 2. Maybe we can fill it out now with number 2. Number 2, James calls us to put life into perspective in verse 14. When he says, "Whereas you do not know what's going to happen tomorrow, what's your life? It's a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away." What do you take away from that passage? Are we supposed to have a pessimistic outlook on life? And if not, how do we explain this verse? Because it seems like he's drawing our attention to a pretty dark subject here. What's your take on this verse in relation to everything he's saying? What do you take away from this, Terry? Okay. Yeah, and I think that's the key to it. If we start making plans and we don't put God in the picture, is that a really foolish thing? Why is that? We don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. We have no control over tomorrow. So a person who tries to make these long-term plans as if somehow he's in control of his life doesn't even know whether he's going to be here tomorrow or not. That's the foolishness of that. Look at Proverbs chapter 27. Hold your place. Go back to Proverbs chapter 27. Very same principle, right? So he's asking this question in James, but here's another way of looking at that. Chapter 27, look at verse 1. "Don't boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth." We have no way of knowing that. There is someone who does know about tomorrow. Who's that? Well, God does, right? So, Art was drawing attention to that statement in Romans, if it is the will of God that I can do this, that's the way life has to be. God knows but I don't know. So if I'm going to plan, I've got to make sure that I'm planning. So go back and look at verse 14 now, or verse 13. So here's the boast. They're saying, today or tomorrow we'll go to such a city. We're going to spend a year there. We're going to buy and sell and make a profit. Now put that in the context of what he said in verse 14. Do you know whether or not you'll be alive tomorrow? I don't know that. None of us know that. Do you know that you'll be physically able to make the trip that you're planning tomorrow? I don't know if I'll be able to make that trip or not. I don't even know if the conditions will be right for travel. They may not be. I don't even know, according to the wisdom of this person who's got the worldly wisdom, right? I'm going to go and I'm going to buy and sell and get gain. I don't even know if I'll make a profit because I'm not in control of tomorrow, and I don't know when or if I'll leave the city that I'm going to. See, that's the problem with making plans without God. I just don't know what tomorrow is going to hold. So he asked this question, what is your life? What he calls us to do is now reflect deeply on what life really is. So when we think maybe life is a bum trip, we forget that it's a gift from God. Or if it's just sort of a dead-end street, we forget that God makes life full of opportunities. That if it's hard and unfair, maybe we forget that Jesus makes a difference in everything that we do. All right? It's easy to do that. We all fall into that trap sometimes. So he reminds us, his answer is, your life is a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. And the word here means mist. I don't know if you have that in translation. Some do. It's like fog. It's like smoke. It's like a breath, right? That's we've often illustrated when, especially in the cooler times of the year, when you walk outside and you take out the trash or you start the car or something, and when you breathe, you see your breath. You see that exhale for just a few seconds, and then it's gone. That's the way life is. Or like, it was a little hazy because of the humidity this morning, and yet that'll be gone just in a few hours when the sun is fully up. That's the way life is. It's here for just a moment, and then it's gone. We are reminded in Scripture about the brevity and uncertainty of life. We're told often about that. Let's take a look at a couple of passages. I wrote down a bunch, but let's just take a look at a few of these. Go back with me to Job. Job chapter 7. Here's just a sampling of these. Job chapter 7. There's a bunch about how uncertain life is. There's no guarantee of tomorrow. Job chapter 7. And of course, you can take some of these statements and put them in the context of his conversations with his friends. They weren't being too kind to Job about his reality. And Job sometimes responds in the middle of his suffering, so you've got to remember his suffering context. But look at verse 6. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle, and are spent without hope. Oh, remember that my life is a breath. My eye will never again see good. The eye of him who sees me will see me no more. While your eyes are upon me, I shall no longer be. As the cloud disappears and vanishes away, so is he who goes down to the grave. He does not come up. He shall never return to his house, nor shall his place know him anymore. And there's sort of a grave, almost depressing portrait of life. But there's a reality that it presents to us that life is just very momentary. It's just very brief. For as long as it may be, right? You can live long on this earth. It's still just a blink of an eye. We're here one moment, we're gone the next. Look at chapter 9, same book, chapter 9, verse 25. Now my days are swifter than a runner. That would be like a delivery person, right? They're UPS, FedEx, United States Postal Service, and the Postal Service is not that fast, so maybe you could just do FedEx and UPS, right? Amazon delivery, my days are swifter than a runner. They flee away, they see no good, they pass by like swift ships, like the eagle swooping on its prey. And he's illustrating how quick life is, right? So you're anxious for a package to arrive, and you turn your eye away for just a second. It's there. That's the way life is. Like the eagle grabbing its prey, right? You have to see a slow motion version of that, or it's very quick. That's the way life is. And so it's easy to forget that life is that way, and then we become presumptuous and we make plans, and we forget I'm not in control ultimately of life. I'm free to make decisions, but I can't make plans without God because I can't even tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. And that's his point in verse 14 when he says, life's like a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Even a full life is just but for a moment. It appears and it disappears. That's the folly of making plans without God. Any thoughts on that before we move on? It really is. Steve, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. He had tried, yeah. That's right. I'm ready. However I get there, if God allows it, if I do, yeah. So, yeah, that's right. And I think that's how we have to be. I think we're about to see that in James. That has to be our attitude. If the Lord wills, and then whatever happens, happens. But I'll be ready to do whatever is within the will of God. Okay, so that brings us to number 3. So we're gonna take verse 15 and verse 17 as a group this time. James chapter 4 has often been used, number 3, to apply to any good thing, right? So I've heard people say this. Verse 17, to him that knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. And so if you miss an opportunity to do something that was really good, you've done wrong to do that. So it's often been applied sort of in a just generic, universal way. Is that what James is saying here? And if we keep the context, especially from verse 15, what's his point in this passage? And how do we do this in a very practical way? How can we do this practically? So let's take a look. First of all, let's start in verse 15. Let's get the context and see if it makes a difference on verse 17. We'll talk about verse 17 in just a second. Verse 15. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. Is he saying that before we do anything, we actually, with our mouth, verbally have to say out loud, if the Lord wills? Is that what he's suggesting? This is a magic verbal formula that unlocks the power of planning. Is that what he's saying? Okay. You could say it. There's nothing wrong with saying that. And I've heard people say that, right? Somebody will say, hey, I hope to be there tomorrow if the Lord wills. Nothing wrong with that at all. But I think Terry's exactly right if you didn't hear him. It's not just what we say verbally, it's what's going on up here. There's something that we are admitting when we plan something in our heart. We understand that there's a part of it that secures whatever fulfillment there is. Kind of goes to what Steve was just saying, that I'm ready to do whatever I need to do, but God also has a part in the planning process. So it's not just a verbal expression. It is an attitude. Now, I will admit, in Scripture, there are times when we read one of those in Romans 1 where expressions like that are found, where people do verbally express that. Paul himself said, if this is the will of God, I'll come to you in Rome. But it's not a magical verbal formula. It's what's up here. It's an attitude of, I understand that God has a part in life. And you see this especially, all right, go back in your mind to the Garden of Gethsemane, and 3 times Jesus said something very similar to this, right? He was praying to his Father about the will that involved Calvary, and what did he say 3 times to his Father about the redemptive plan? Not my will, but your will be done, okay? So I understand there's greater wills at work, and I'm going to submit to the greater will of my Father in heaven, and that's the way we have to be. This is a deliberation in our mind and our heart that ends with a purposeful considering of the place of God in our life. I know that God could have other plans. I think Steve just brought that out or mentioned it earlier. I'm going to plan this, but I understand that God's plans may be different than mine, and I'm willing to accept whatever God's plans are. Every plan that we have must be dependent upon God for fulfillment, even if He changes the fulfillment to something different. Now, see if verse 17 reads differently. Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. What does he mean by that in this context? If you don't put God in your plans, and you know you should do that, what is it? It's sin. It's wrong to do that. In the context, that's how he's applying this statement. This is the conclusion he's making from verse 15. It is not a proverb that applies to every single thing across life. For example, would it be a good thing for you? Is it good for you to sell your car and give that money to the poor? So if you don't do that, is that a sin? That's not how you apply that across the board, because there's a lot of good things that if we don't do them, it's sort of neutral, right? Now, you can't be like Ananias and Sapphira and do a good thing and then lie about the thing that you've done, right? Like Acts chapter 5. But this is not a general statement of, it would be a good thing for me to quit my secular job and go preach the gospel in India. That's a good thing. But it's not sin if you choose to maintain your job, right? So this is applied very specifically. This is not a proverb that just every good thing that you don't do ends up being a sin, because he's here putting it in the context of making plans in life without God in the picture. And so what is good in this passage, what is morally and spiritually excellent in context, is putting our will under the will of God. And when we do not do that, it is sin according to this passage. If we refuse the Lord's will and His providence in our life, we are sinning. Now, there's still some truth that comes out of that. Here's the truth. And these are some things we have to consider, right? Because I think there's a general principle here. You have to be careful how you apply it. There's still a principle of His requiring us to do good in this life. So here's the truth. Christianity is not just abstaining from evil. And I think sometimes we think that, right? Look what I did not do. I didn't commit adultery. I didn't commit murder. I didn't go out and involve myself in the occult. And you could abstain from all of those things and still be in trouble with God for what you did not do. All right? So Christianity is not just the religion of abstaining from things. Christianity is the life of doing good. And we have to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of doing that. I know sometimes people argue, they argue against things. Look what I abstained from. Great, that's really good. Did you also do good things? Because doing good things is part of that. And the point is, we can be just as lost for what we did not do versus what we abstained from. So look at Matthew 25. Here's a great example of that. Matthew 25. Here's a great example illustrated by the Lord Himself of that very principle, Matthew 25. It's a long chapter. We're going to drop down to verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in His glory and all the holy angels with Him, then He will sit on the throne of His glory. All the nations will be gathered before Him. He'll separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And He will set the sheep on His right hand, but the goats on the left. Then the King will say to those on the right hand, "Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." Watch carefully. "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer Him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick in prison and come to you?" And the King will answer and say to them, "Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it from one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me." And then the reverse is true, beginning in verse 42. "Say to those on the left, depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For the opposite reason, I was hungry, you didn't give me food. I was thirsty, you didn't give me drink," and so on. So this passage illustrates that you have just good things under consideration, and some people were lost because they didn't do good things, right? You could have abstained from adultery and never committed fornication, and you could have abstained from lasciviousness and immodesty and all those things and still be lost for not doing good. And I think that same thing is also illustrated in Luke 12, verses 47 and 48, when he talks about the abstaining from good things. And I think, if anything, James 4:17 reminds us that it's not just abstaining from bad things, it's also doing good things. And when we don't do the good things that God would have us to do, we could be in danger. But in the context, he's specifically saying, if you plan your life without consideration of God, it's sin to do that, because you, as Christians, you know better than to do that. Any thoughts on this? I think this is a great passage. Such a good passage, and probably in James, a favorite for a lot of people, because I think of all the verses here, life as a vapor is probably the one we consider the most. Just really good. Tommy?
Well, as Christians, we should be, I want to say concerned, but our direction should be considering God in everything we do. Not that we have to, like you say, acknowledge it every time we do something.
Right, yeah.
But our life is based on following God's word. And when we do that, most times the things that we're going to do in the future are based on that foundation of following God's word.
Mm-hmm.
Although a certain thing may not be a religious or a spiritual thing, we still live our lives with God as the foundation.
It has to be part of it. It's kind of like a filter, right? Everything we do has to be poured through the filter of God, right? It's everything. It's just like, was it Matthew 23:23, where he says, you pay tithe of mint, anise, and cumin, but you've neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These you ought to have done and not leave the others undone, which means that you're supposed to do it all, but that paying tithe of mint, anise, and cumin is supposed to be filtered through, faithfulness and all the things that he mentioned in that passage. It's the same with God. I think Tom is exactly right. There's just this acknowledgement in everything that we do, that whatever it is that we do, it goes through the filter of God. Everything is in life, no matter what we're doing, it has to be poured through that filter. Otherwise, what are we? It's just it's not a biblical worldview if that's the view that we have in life. Okay, chapter 5 next week. The first 6 verses. This is one of those passages, and when James gets through, it's like sometimes Jesus did this. It is a scathing rebuke of riches that are not wrong in and of themselves, but it's the handling of those riches that gets some consideration here. At the end of it, you just go, whoo, man, that's tough, because he's really hard on people who abuse riches. We're going to take a look at that next week. I look forward to your input on that passage as well. Thank you so much.